I'm Shane Kilkelly, and you're listening to General Intellect Unit. In this episode, we'll be picking up on part 2 of our discussion of Red Plenty. If you missed part 1, I'd recommend pausing this episode, going back to the previous one and starting from there. Thanks for listening, and enjoy the show. That is where the sort of next chapter brings us, where we have this biologist, Zoya, who's arriving at a science town in the middle of nowhere.
There's one point I wanted to bring up about that chapter about Akadem Gorodok. And just a moment, I gotta find this quote, because I wrote it down, but it's too messy to read. But it's a very important quote, I think. So it says, I couldn't work out whether I was listening to Bohemians disguised as good boys or good boys disguised as Bohemians. You bubble like dreamers, and then it turns out you're dreaming of the 5-year plan.
Yeah, this is important.
So good. Such an excellent description of this way of thinking. And I think about myself as a younger person, and that's an excellent description of the way I used to think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or the way that is characteristic of these kinds of prophets of modernity, right? Like Saint-Simon or something. That, yeah, it's like you're if I think about the inspiration I feel about these kind of utopian projects, and then I think about what the actual implementation details would be. There's such a huge contrast, right? That the reality is I mean, I think these are wonderful ideas, but probably I wouldn't be the one implementing any of these things because I don't have the skill to do it. And I don't really know where I would fit into that picture. But the picture is still very exciting to me, right? So I thought that was an excellent...
You got to never think about consequences. It ruins the fun. You
Yeah,
you got to stay dreaming constantly.
and really, you just get this kind of sense of lightness about this place, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. There's a real levity to it, and I think the character does sort of describe it in terms of that having these discussions with these other comrades here. Felt like she felt lighter for it, a weight was lifting off of her, and they could pick up the world's problems and toy with them and turn them around and look at them from different angles. And there's a levity and a kind of playfulness with being able to manipulate these concepts and also know that they will in some way be reflected in the kind of reality around them as well.
Yes, I think it's really important, this idea of play, because it comes up in the chapter on shadow prices as well. That this idea that the planner needs to be able to play in order to do their job effectively. And I mean, I look at all this stuff and I just see so much of Silicon Valley in what is described here. There's just, that kind of perpetual focus on youthful exuberance and casualness and the sort of dreams of modernity and modernization and the playing with concepts and the sort of willful ignorance of real conditions of life outside of this bubble.
I definitely recognize this as colleagues and I at the pub with 5 or 10 drinks inside us, going through all this kind of stuff. Yeah, these sort of wild dreams of applying a frankly brutal sort of technocracy to the world and seeing it as a perfectly great thing to do.
So it's a good cautionary tale, at least.
yeah, definitely. There's something interesting in how this is presented as it is presented as a bright optimism, but there's something quite sinister about it as well. And I think Zoya even has a little bit of a passage where she the way the mathematicians speak kind of reminds her of her own trade, and the kind of idea of like human beings being simply vehicles for genetic information to play with, and like these kind of, she has this image of like a dark armada moving through time and using humanity as its vehicle, and it's kind of like quite a sinister turn to her imaginings about this. And like the mathematicians remind her of that kind of idea of like, well, it's the numbers that matter, and it's the flesh and blood beings are just the vehicle through which the numbers operate.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a view of the world that has become more and more prevalent. And if we ever get to talking about machine dreams, that is the subject of that book, right? Is that how computing became a model of reality writ large. That like even... So it certainly is the case that, like, as we see in this chapter, there's this convergence between biology and computing that's happening, right? But it goes even further than that, where, like, the modeling that sort of advanced physics does now conceives of the world fundamentally as a computing machine. That it's not that it's being done on computers, it's that our metaphorical, intuitive understanding of the world is in terms of computation. Computation as this kind of detached, generalized process that represents the fundamental ontology we live with. And you can kind of see that getting off the ground here.
Oh, definitely, yeah. I think, like, if I'm remembering some part of All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, if I'm remembering that correctly, I think that's something that Adam Curtis gets into, the kind of, like, the fallacy that we tend to make where we create these simplified computer models, or we use computing to solve a problem, we use it to abstract something, but then we start to mistake the model for reality, and that leads us astray in some pretty weird kind of ways.
Yeah, and I mean, we're sounding very erudite here, but in the end notes of all these chapters, it's just like Adam Curtis, Murawski, like these are the books that they're citing as like the inspirations for these chapters. So of course they're present in these chapters, but you know, I think we may be falling into the same sort of simulacrum. Anyhow,
yeah. Oh no. But at some point in this chapter as well, the kind of like they receive news that like the price of meat is being adjusted upwards, and to the cyberneticians here, that's good news, because it'll alter beef production, and like it'll kind of, I don't know, validate some of their ideas. But that brings us into the next chapter, which is located in another corner of the country where there's quite a bit of civil unrest about precisely this, that the price of meat is going up. And it happens in this location to have been combined with already running like poor conditions, housing shortages, low wages, and a price rise and a pay cut at the same time, which brings the workers out to protest outside the city hall. And it ends in a massacre. Like they're just kind of shot down by the military. And yeah, it's like this is like, no, while the kind of science guys are kind of celebrating the abstraction of what this change will mean, there are very real problems happening on the ground because of it.
Yeah, and this is like, you can see the fantasy of power on the one hand, and then the reality of power on the other hand. That's the contrast that's at work here, right? That, oh yeah, you can abstract these things, but that is accomplished at a price, right? And that price is usually something that is enforced by the state through violence, that makes the reality conform to the model. And yeah, I mean, again, it's like you can just point to Silicon Valley and like the crazy amounts of social engineering that happens in order to suit their whims. And it's like, there's the ideal, and then there's the reality that actually happens, right?
Yeah.
It's not National Guardsmen shooting protesters in the street, but it is police in military gear shooting rubber bullets at people. It is tear gas. It is kettling people. It is, implementing sort of like stop and frisk and all kinds of violence in order to reshape urban landscapes, and bribes paid to politicians, all kinds of things that are necessary to make these abstract ideas come to life. I think the important thing to point out here is that this massacre is what you get from one-sided planning.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
That the orders come down from on high, and the planners aren't even aware. Like, the people in Akadem Gordok literally did not know a single thing about what happened here.
Yeah, they won't hear about it ever. Like,
they never heard anything because this was all covered up. Like, the blood was washed off the street, the square was paved over, and everyone was kept quiet.
Yeah. And the most you would get in the way of an explanation is, there was unrest and the dissidents were dealt with. And that was like they went on trial and were imprisoned, apparently, is the explanation.
Yeah, and there. What information did come out about it was kind of like through the grapevine and dissident networks, and was kind of distorted, and that creates a certain amount of kind of like conspiracy theory thinking and that kind of thing, which can discredit it anyway. I guess we should just mention that the name of the town was Novocherkassk, which was an actual place, and there was an actual massacre, although the timing is adjusted a little bit by the author here.
Which is a bit of a theme, I think, throughout the fictionalization here, that a lot of this is real stuff, but is tweaked to make it kind of fit the kind of flow of a narrative format. But speaking of the kind of bad planning, the kind of intro to chapter or part 4 brings us through the kind of like the actualities of how the planning process worked. And I was kind of like stunned actually to kind of really read through this, and it's like for the planning bureau, it takes basically the entire year to go around the loop a couple of times of like objectives being set from the top, those objectives being sent out to all the kind of regions and the firms and such, and then to have the feedback where they return, well, we can't actually meet that target, we need this, or, well, if we're going to meet that target, we need more rubber to be shipped over from this place, and like they go around the loop again, and they kind of redistribute the numbers, and then they kind of like, this takes an entire year basically, and like barely scrapes by into the deadline, where it's like actually put into effect. And it's like, I don't know, really, really easy to see why this would be a desirable thing to optimize the shit out of this thing. Because, like, taking, like, 11 and a half months to formulate a plan for the economy and, like, not even being sure you've got it right must be pretty hellish.
Yeah, the process is very slow. And in a way, it's kind of like a realization of the image of the market that is given in the shadow prices chapter, right?
Yeah,
from the photograph chapter, right? Just that it is this sort of serial process that very, very slowly works through problems. It's not in real time, but it's like there's no do-overs, there's no parallel plans, right? Yeah. It's just it takes up all the efforts of Gosplan just to make this one plan. And yeah, you can see the advantages that would be afforded by simulation or computation, network technology, all those kind of things. But there's sort of a reference at the end of that introduction to, like it says, what is it? All clear so far, right?
Yeah.
So like you go through this huge process of back and forth and control figures and adjustments and so on, and then it just says all clear so far. And apparently this is a reference to Kim Stanley Robinson talking about the U.S. military procurement process. And actually, I heard an interview with someone from the military on By Any Means Necessary, and she was saying, like, yeah, this procurement process is like something that has to start like 3 years in advance, right? for this, like, because the U.S. military is basically a giant planned economy, right? And the whole planning process is probably just about as complex and convoluted as what you would see in this chapter.
Yeah, definitely. And we do get a bit of a look into the kind of inner workings of it in the immediate sort of chapter where we meet Mokov, who works at Gosplan, and he's kind of a veteran of the process. He has kind of insight into, like, he kind of knows. He just knows how it works. You know, he's got the magic touch that can make any of these adjustments work. But he's a kind of an interesting line about, like, he kind of understands that this you could never capture the activity of something so huge in 373 folders. Like, they have this huge room of, like, all the records and all the details, the plan, and, like, he goes in there and gets an abacus and goes messing with it. But he understands that this is an abstraction. It's not the actual economy. But it has worked. It has worked for 30 years, and he's kind of adamant on that, like, this might be a weird sort of way of doing it, but it does seem to actually bear out results. But the interesting thing here is...
he just doesn't understand why it works,
yeah,
which is something we're going to find out when we go further down the line.
It is absolutely mystified, the workings of this thing. But, like, the conceit here is that he's received a kind of a notification from a plant in Solovets producing some sort of cord or linen or something. But one of their lines is down because, like, the machine got damaged in an accident, and they need another one of those machines. And he's got to look at, like, well, if you don't provision it, then the manufacturing of tires will be affected, and that will ripple out through the economy. So he's kind of putting it together, and he's like, well, okay, fine, we'll it'll be an inconvenience for the manufacturers of this machine, but, like, we'll add another one to the thing. I know it's kind of nice because there's an upgraded model anyway, so that's kind of cool. Just put through the order.
Yeah, and it says he the way he thinks about this is really interesting. He says a reminder of planned discipline would do no harm, but they would have their PNSH 18014S. And so would all of his enterprises that were expecting one. Uralmash could be Sioux some other way. In the box next to the word production on the left-hand side of the new page, he wrote firmly, 18. There was the budget of pain shared out, and shared out more or less evenly, since there must be a budget of pain.
Yeah. He's got a hell of a way of thinking about
this. So apparently this character was based on the Grand Inquisitor in the Brothers Karamazov. It's very interesting. It's like, because he's like, oh, those number crunchers in Akadem Gordok, they don't understand how this process actually works, right? Like they think it's all about just coming up with a number or, like, a total solution to the plan. But I understand that there's this budget of pain, and I have to share it out evenly. And so he's about, like, that's his sort of semi-personal understanding of the people he's working with.
Yeah, and it very much is a personal understanding. Like, there isn't much of a science to this. It's just the practice he's picked up over the course of however many decades he's been doing this.
And there's sort of a moment where he's like, This industrial accident does seem kind of suspicious, and in the good old days, we would have just killed everyone involved. But these are new times, so I'm just going to give them a rap on the machine. Yeah, like I'll just give them a reprimand and give them the machine, right? And we can see later on that his decision not to kill these managers is part of the reason why the system starts to break down.
Yeah.
Because the system of punishment is becoming lax, and it starts to lead to perverse outcomes, right? Because as long as the system was enforced by terror on pain of death, it worked to a certain degree, but when you lax things up in a system that is all about giving commands from on high, it does start to get a little bit loose.
It does, yeah, and it sort of masks a lower layer of just petty corruption and sort of looseness in the sort of bottom layers that these guys can't really even account for. Like he has no idea of like the stuff we'll see later. Or one of the things we see immediately in the next chapter is that it was in fact sabotage. That the Solovets guys were kind of like worried that they couldn't meet the plan because it turned out that machine was kind of shitty at its job.
But they couldn't tell anyone that the machine was shitty at its job.
Right, yeah, exactly right. Like there was a bad incentive there. Like they couldn't like because they'd probably be shot for that anyway. But if they wrecked it in a convenient sort of accident, they might get provisioned with a newer one. When so this like he was kind of the guy was kind of on the money with this, that like when in his initial suspicion that it could have been a ruse, you know, because it was.
He just didn't understand why it might be. Like he tries to like puzzle through all the reasons why this might have happened. He's like, it just doesn't make sense. And then
it's a tractor parked on an embankment and it slipped. And it's like, no, it just seems too plausible. You know, we won't investigate.
It's like, well, they made their targets last term, so why would they destroy their own equipment? That doesn't make any sense. And then we actually see what happens, and it's like, oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a real discrepancy here between the abstraction and the actuality. Like, we're starting to see this now, that, like in the first half of the book, we've been introduced to this idea of, like, these mathematicians could introduce these abstractions and kind of like bring rationality and control to the economy. And we're starting to now see the discrepancy between that view of the world and the kind of truth that plays out on the ground. It gets especially messy when the next chapter where we're introduced to Chekushkin, who's like a fixer or a buying agent, and it's for kind of the state. And it's kind of his job is to make this the fulfillment of the plan and the kind of allocation of these resources go a bit more smoothly than it ordinarily would.
Well, he is strictly speaking a criminal, right?
I see. I didn't quite pick that up.
He is a quote unquote pusher, which was a type of black marketeer that existed in the Soviet Union, and because he is encouraging deviation from the plan, he is committing a crime.
Right.
Because he's sort of like moving the means of production around without the authorization of the state, which is not permitted.
I was under the impression, like, I think because he had like a nice office and got phone calls from people who seemed to be well placed in the state or in the sort of management hierarchy, I was under the impression that he was somehow part of the official running of things. But no, that does make a lot more sense.
He is part of it. He's just part of it. He's a part of it that cannot be admitted by the state, right? Like, he is actually helping to fulfill the plan, but he's doing it in a way that cannot be acknowledged by anyone who he is working with.
Yeah, and like in this chapter he sort of talks about how there's a lot of messy human interactions going on in this kind of like vast economy, and that like, well, if you want your like provisions to come through quickly, you got to know the right people, you know, this sort of thing. It's just this petty corruption, this small low level sort of corruption that seems to permeate the whole damn economy at this point, and that is kind of like hived off and not really visible to the actual planners. I mean, it's questionable as to what extent they would be aware of it even, because as far as they can I'd imagine from the top levels of Gosplan, from what they can tell, they write a number in a box on a form and that number becomes real somehow. Like the somehow the mystery meat, you know, there's a mystery as to how it actually comes about, and this is how it happens. And like he has dealings with the sort of the mafia, like to, and like it's kind of strange because like he hands over a big wad of cash, and it's to get the speedy delivery of some small quantity of material for a construction job to finish, you know, for another client. It's just small tweaks around the margins that make the economy actually work.
Yes, because essentially he is making adjustments in supply allotments in order to make sure that the managers can meet the targets they need to meet, right? And it's like, oh, well, you have a little. It's very much. If I don't know if you ever seen that episode of Deep Space Nine, where Quark's nephew is teaching his friend Jake about like the Ferengi rules of acquisition, and like essentially they're in this kind of problem. Like they need to get some kind of means of production, but because of the war situation, it's difficult to get a hold of. So Quark's nephew goes through this big long process of like, oh, I'll give you some of this, and then take some of that, and like basically going through these favors in order to arrange to get this equipment, right?
Right.
And it's all kind of played off as like this absurd thing because they are living in this society of socialist plenty. So this Ferengi obsession with profit making and deal making is kind of ridiculous. But this was like the actual way that the plan worked, right? This is how the budget of pain was dealt out, was that it was done through these pushers. It was done through like personal connections between people. And it was also done through the mafia. And like these were the actual mechanisms of the economy that allowed it to function. And that is why the mafia came out of the end of the Soviet Union so immensely powerful, is because they were actually like a core and fundamental institution of the way that the economy functioned.
Yeah, they were running the whole game all along, you know?
Yeah, they just, you know, they grew out of the gulags, and then they slowly but surely started to become more and more useful until eventually they just took over the whole country, right? So yeah, it's something that is completely obscured to our good friend the Gauss planner, but that's the way it actually works. And you know, they do say that the mafia was kind of restricted in its growth because they relied on cash, and cash couldn't actually buy very much in the Soviet Union because it was this seller's market, right? Where it wasn't like, the thing about the pusher that is really, really interesting is like he considers himself to be the opposite of a salesman. Like, it's like, I am a salesman, but I'm also the opposite of a salesman, because he grew up during the NEP period and he was working as a salesperson. So he understood what it was to like make a deal and get a sale, right? You always have, in a capitalist system, you always, or almost always have, more supply than there is demand, right? And you have to make those sales. You have to go from the marketers and you have to go around to people and say, oh, please buy this thing, right? Each of us only wants to buy one vacuum cleaner out of the like 20 that's on display. But in the Soviet system, it was more of a case of convincing the people who held things to sell them.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the thing about this factory that has this machine that the machine factory that is producing the machine that the textile factory needs, right? It's already allocated in the plan that this machine should go from factory A to factory B. So that's all above board, but they need someone to come in and convince the people who are producing the means of production to actually make the sale they're supposed to make, because of the way that there's a persistent tendency towards hoarding in this system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But like that sort of like the way this machine problem kind of works out here is actually kind of horrifying, where like he speaks to a friend about it, and it turns out that this is a kind of a budgetary issue, and that like on top of that, like all eyes are on this facility because there's just something fucking strange about how this machine got offline. But the thing is, the upgraded machine would be easier and quicker to manufacture, but it costs less than the old model. So producing it would ruin the maker's numbers for the year.
Yes, so they wouldn't hit their target, and so their careers would be ruined.
Right. And like it costs less because it weighs less. It's a better machine that weighs less and is more efficient, but it's the wrong thing to do to fucking make it and distribute it.
because they're using a pricing system that is based on weight. Right? And because there is no market, they can't get market prices. So they have, if they are coming up with a price, they have to come up with a price based on something, right? And the thing they decided to go by was weight.
Yeah, because it's the most obvious property of any object.
Right. So like these are the kinds of problems that you get in a non-monetary planned economy, which like Mises attacked, right? In saying like, this is a completely irrational system, it will never work. Well, actually, it can kind of work.
If it's not done this way.
Yeah, I mean, even this way, it kind of works, right? Like, the society did exist for a number of decades. But you have to think very, very hard about the criteria you're using to develop prices, and the way you do that if you're going to use a price system, because we treat prices as a given and obvious thing in a capitalist economy, but you just can't do that in a socialist economy. You
need some of the mechanisms that some of these cyberneticians are coming up, or something analogous to it, where that's like a fully thought out way of like communicating some information about the various objects in the system and how they're going to relate to each other.
And you need accurate supply information, right? Accurate supply information, which they cannot get because everybody at the managerial level is constantly in a position of desperately trying to get a hold of things while fudging the numbers to make it seem that they've fulfilled their targets.
Whilst hoarding things and,
Yes. Everybody wants to hoard as much as they can. The Soviet Union was a incredible system of material hoarding. There's a really, really good paper I read about this once, that just the stockpiles that existed everywhere, because everybody was just trying to cling on to as much as they can because they were always worried about a supply shortage that would throw off their fulfillment numbers and therefore cause their careers to be ruined. Right?
Yeah. And like that's kind of what shoots a hole in this cybernetician sort of dream, is that like even if they could computerize the economy and then they could figure out getting enough computing power to process it and they could do it quick enough and they could convince everyone to get on board with it, they just have the shittiest data you could possibly imagine. Like everyone's lying, everyone's fudging the numbers constantly. There's no quick way of getting a grip on what commodities are moving where. It's just, it can't really work at that kind of level of technology.
There's a dearth of trust in the system and a dearth of surveillance, right? Like even though there's spies everywhere, right? You
got to have them spy on trucks, you see, and trailers full of bricks and stuff. They got to keep an eye on that stuff because that would have been useful for the planning. But the intro to part 5 then kind of brings on to a little bit of a kind of an explainer of like kind of why this society degraded over time in the way it did. And the core of the idea is that like the initial sort of revolutionaries were very much like philosopher kings who felt compelled to like act like thugs in order to like carry out this kind of plan. But that the society they created, or the structure they created, and the state that they put in place in its bureaucracy was optimized in such a way that like ordinary thugs would be attracted to it and ascend its ranks, who would only pretend to care about the ideas and then eventually give up even on the pretension of caring about those. So you get this kind of like ideological and intellectual decline over time through the generations until you end up with like the later stages of the Soviet Union where it's just like proper old school gangsters running the place who don't actually have no affiliation even, or no like no ambition to carry out the plans that were laid by the people that came before them.
Yeah, and the final reform movement basically just ran into that problem among other things, but it's just many of the party members and managers were just complete cynics at this point. Because there is this system of meritocracy that was based on, one, keeping your mouth shut and complying with power, and two, following metrics that didn't make any sense. It produced this complete cynicism all the way down the line. And, you know, it's very similar to what you see happen to education under charter schools, right? They're run ostensibly on meritocratic grounds. There's a whole bunch of like data points and testing and all kinds of like fancy doodads that are done in order to try to allocate resources rationally. But ultimately what it comes down to is it's all just about corruption and class war.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. That like these schools are being set up in order to break teachers' unions and in order to establish new techniques of control over impoverished neighborhoods. That's what it's really about. And that encourages enormous cynicism in teachers, right? To live in that system. And you can kind of just see that these sort of like low-key progressive degenerations of public spiritedness and faith in other people that are characteristic of neoliberalism are just like cranked up to the nth degree in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Right.
It's kind of interesting that like through its whole development, the Soviet Union kind of mirrors the rest of the West and its kind of modernity. But it's like the Soviet Union is that on intramuscular steroids. It's just like, it's more hierarchical, it's more fucking crazy, it's more cynical eventually, it's initially more ambitious. It's there's like a real distinct kind of mirroring going on there. Or not a mirroring, but like a parallel, but like amped up in I suppose a typically Russian sort of way.
Right.
But yeah, and so like, I mean, but by the sort of early 60s, Khrushchev is like, he's surrounded by this kind of this state that are like or even like his whole cadre are people he's appointed himself, and they're his people, but he is starting to alienate them because like he's starting to seem kind of a bit unstable and dangerous to the rest of his sort of people, and he's making bigger and bigger sort of promises and trying kind of more. He's kind of like screwing up pretty consistently in agriculture and foreign policy and trade, and he's just kind of getting angrier and more impatient and confused, and things just aren't sort of going his way at all. Which ends eventually in him getting chucked in 1964 and replaced. And we get a nice little chapter that's kind of like from his driver's perspective, where he's kind of like bringing him out to the countryside to be just kind of packaged away in his countryside house for his retirement.
Yeah, and it's just like a matter of like going from the ZIL car and then it's like, oh, the ZIL's taken away, and then they bring in the Chaika, and the driver's like, yeah, it's fine, Chaika's not okay. So bad, you know, it's all right. But then the horror of horrors, they bring in the next car, and it is the Volga, right? And it's like, oh, then he knew it was like it was over. It was
a real plebeian car, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean this is a thing that you can imagine happening easily in a capitalist system, but the thing is that like the connection between political power and economic allotment is so exact in this society, right? That it's like, oh, okay, you've been demoted this many ranks, and because what you get in your material goods is not really determined by how much money you make. It's determined by what's provided to you directly by the state. It's just this extremely exact representation of your demotion.
Yeah.
This is exactly the car you get, which corresponds to exactly this rank of person. That's who you are now.
There's something comical in how the cars do come in sequence, right? Like, and it's almost as if he's descending the ranks like a ball going downstairs, right? Like he's not demoted immediately to his sort of final level. He kind of like descends each of them in turn, which is kind of comical.
Yeah, it is. It is definitely is. There's a little bit of like a sort of just this progressive dejection. It's like the bargaining process of grieving, right? Like, well, it's not so bad. And then they bring out the Volga, and you're like, oh shit,
this is pretty bad.
Yeah.
And poor Khrushchev is crushed by this. He's like not in good spirits at all.
They're all crammed into this little car.
But we're kind of coming up on probably one of the sort of last significant chapters before we start to wrap things up, in which Emil is kind of brought in front of state planning to kind of talk over these reforms that are going to be brought in. This is 1965, and it sort of doesn't go terribly well, and mostly because the planners intend to adopt some of the reforms that he's been suggesting, but notably with the absence of the shadow prices, which he insists are just absolutely critical. Like, there is no point in doing these reforms if you don't do them all at the same time. Or like, especially you could lose some other detail, but the shadow prices are the critical component, because otherwise you're going to end up with insane kind of misaligned incentives where the system will shake itself apart, by his reckoning.
Yeah, so they're going to implement a profit criterion for planning targets. But the thing is that the prices that are going to be used to evaluate the profit are not going to be based on the system of linear planning or linear programming that they've been planning to use, right? The shadow prices they've been planning to create. So because the origin or the basis of the prices is irrational, the entire system will be irrational. And on top of that, they want to have a profit incentive and also a fulfillment target in material terms. And so the planners will always be like, well, which one do I follow? I don't know. So it's just going to create this complete breakdown of any kind of rationality in the planning system. But for Kosygin, it's just like, well, this is a reasonable compromise, right? Like, we can do these reforms, we're not going to go too far. They think about it in very just sort of like political terms, right?
Yeah,
like,
it's real politics.
Let's find the compromise position here.
Yeah. And like Emil storms out, or I think he's kind of semi-ejected from the building, really. But he's taken for a bit of a stroll around the park by Mokov, who we saw a bit earlier. And he sort of he tries to kind of like talk him around, because like what we're seeing here is this conversation between the state apparatus and kind of naive, idealistic mathematicians. And Mokov kind of emphasizes that the reform collides with the need for stability, and that our economy has its faults, but it feeds and clothes our citizens better than a large majority of the people on the planet. And like we can see now that we've definitely arrived in this era of like a comfortable status quo, and we're probably going to sit there at the expense of improvement.
Yeah, and like the Bolshevik state, the party state, was established in order to do this sort of like bold, extreme project of modernization to just drive towards full communism as aggressively as possible. But by inches, it became a system that was about perpetuating its own existence, right? You go from modernization plans to stability concerns, and from stability concerns to personal graft, right?
Yeah. And like, it's kind of like easy to see why it happens though, because or like, one of the reasons that Mokov is kind of explaining for them rejecting this, these particular set of reforms that are like as crucial to the success of the plan, is that the present system allows them to exercise discretion and to make human adjustments that the machine could never account for. And Emil responds, well, like, but optimal prices don't contain errors. And then, of course, he gets the rebuttal, well, like, don't they? Like, it's so obvious to the planners that, like, that's a fucking silly idea. Like, the notion that you could get this right in one go is insane. But, like, it's not. That objection just isn't clear to Emil at all. Like, it's as if he's never really considered that the computerization could be wrong.
It's very much the economics professor talking to the business school professor, right? It's like
So yeah, we're seeing the kind of like technological hubris and the sort of naivety in Emil, but this kind of like smarmy pragmatism in Mokov, which is it's quite a fun little scene. And he kind of leaks a bit as well that like the party does seem to be semi-acknowledging that they are abandoning the pursuit of full communism without really admitting to it. And Emil is struck by this and thinks he's got to actually kind of reevaluate his perspective on the world. But it closes out with a kind of an interesting sort of anecdote from Mokov where he kind of like relates a story about back in his early days where he and his team were tasked with basically just burning bonds in a big old furnace to clear out capital or something. I think there was some objective needed to be met.
Basically, the state owed debts to people. Like they had war bonds. And they were just like, well, we'll just burn all of those.
It's powerful sort of imagery, but he sort of sums it up with like, money will never be allowed to have the last word here. It will never be allowed to be active. It will never be permitted to become an autonomous power. And that's it. Like, there's no fucking way they're going to allow computerized money to take over this society. It reminds you a little bit of our kind of financialized capital, like, and like, yeah, there really is a heart to that like the plan that these scientists and mathematicians were proposing was like kind of cool in the abstract, and like I think has definitely the kernel of a great idea in there, but like under the conditions they had in the Soviet Union at the time, it would have been insane to implement it. To give this
because we saw what happened when the price of meat alone went up, right?
Yeah. Now imagine the price of everything goes everywhere.
Yeah.
Constantly.
The price of everything in the entire economy is going to be adjusted up or down in one planning term.
Mm-hmm. Or like in the span of seconds, you know. There's
I mean, in a way that might be better, but like the if it was say like a 3-month term in adjustments, and it was just like, oh crap, like everything has been thrown out of whack, right? Like it's wow. Yeah, it's crazy.
So ultimately here the human bureaucracy needs to retain control. And, you know, I think they are aware at this point that like there's too much of a human touch in the planning of this system to allow it to be computerized. And it's not a realm in which they can afford to let mathematicians who've lived relatively comfortable lives in Siberia like play with this stuff. I mean, you know, the word play came up before, but I think that is legitimately how Emil and his cohort saw that as a mix between play and work. And like, no, you can't really afford that.
The budget of pain must be respected.
Yeah. So we get a chapter then where we return to Galina.
Speaking of budgets of pain.
Yeah, exactly. Jesus, this is quite a literal one. Where Galina, who we saw at the exhibition way back, is now kind of living a fairly mediocre sort of life in Moscow. But she's the majority of the chapter is taken up with her arriving at a hospital to give birth, and just these shitty fucking conditions, and like there's no morphine available at all for her until she kind of makes a point of insisting that her husband is a powerful person in the party, and then she gets a little injection. A nice little tasty treat to take a bit of the edge off.
Right, because the whole story here is pretty interesting, where there was a method of psychoprophylaxis that was developed by a Soviet scientist in order to like encourage natural childbirth. But this was adopted as like the official policy of the Soviet Union, and then it was never actually successfully rolled out, right? Like, they didn't actually train people to properly instruct anyone in the method.
Oh yeah, she shows up here and like they're like, oh, something about this method, and she's like, what? Nobody said anything about this, and like even the nurse can't even like take the time to explain it to her in the moment. She just chucked.
Yeah, and then the person who did go to the classes like didn't actually get anything useful because the person who was teaching her didn't actually understand the method, and so in the end, all it really becomes is an excuse not to spend money on morphine, right? And the only way that she's able to get around that is by insisting on her status. So again, it's just showing that like there is this sort of very innovative idea that has come up with by a Soviet scientist, and then they try to implement the idea, and it's a complete catastrophe, and it ends up just becoming this farce, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It certainly is farcical, and that's 1966 by the time that happens, and like farce comes up in the kind of intro to part 6 as well, where we sort of start to wrap up a few threads. But that yeah, the reforms did nothing to slow or to stop the slowing of the growth rate. Oil money helped to prop up the economy from 1969 onwards. You got some luxury items were made available, you know, like your sort of washing machines and your TVs and such. Soviet citizens started to be able to take vacations, but it really wasn't enough to like have both have like expanded consumption and the new industrial revolution that they were trying to plan for. And, you know, all the military spending all together, like it wasn't really enough for that at all.
Yeah, and I remember I was doing research last year for a tabletop game I was considering writing about the Stasi. So I was doing research about the GDR, and it pretty much followed the same historical trajectory there. Like, after the end of the Stalin period, there was sort of this push towards high tech and creating like a new sort of capital intensive and innovative economy. But when that failed, it just kind of fell back into this like limping along mediocrity until the final collapse. So that, you know, it's you know that your socialist economy has collapsed or is about to collapse when you only have oil wealth left to save you, right? It's like, we couldn't actually make an effective productive system, so we're just going to collect rent and dole it out to people. Like, I mean, by that measure, like, Saudi Arabia is a sterling example of socialism, right? Which certainly isn't.
Yeah. By that time, like, the decline had really started to fully set in. All talk of full communism had been abandoned at that point, and it had become a bizarre system that was. It was an economy of bloat rather than growth at that point.
Yeah, because the people still needed jobs, right? So there's just this kind of pointless production for the sake of production, once again creating this like strange parody of capitalism, right? Like it's like, you know, Marx says, I think somewhere in Capital Volume 1, he's talking about production for the sake of production, money for the sake of money. But, like, actually, that was realized in the Soviet system at the end there, where it was just like, well, we make the things because we make the things.
Well, that's what we do, right? This is the thing. And it's a theme throughout all of this that, like, you get really good at the thing you do, right? Like, and that becomes your expertise. And, like, that was true of the bureaucracy. It was true of the kind of like entire economy, where just like making shit at a fucking huge velocity was the expertise. You just keep doing it.
Yeah, and it's like the quality doesn't matter. It's just how much steel you produce, right?
Just like like this, like, you know, they're like churning out steel and just throwing it in a fucking lake somewhere, probably, because like you got to get rid of it. It's like kind of just steel lying around. It'll make things look ugly. Yeah, like a real fucked up kind of system. But so like the next chapter, Unified System, is one which Lebedev, the computer designer, is waiting for a meeting, and is kind of running through a lot of the chapter is actually kind of a description of like what happens to cells due to like mutations. He's like a smoker, so he's developing a
cells
cancer.
Upon cells interlinked.
Yeah, those millions and billions of them. But yeah, so it's a chapter in which like I think it has something to say about like deviations and fixes and countermeasures and maintaining homeostasis in a complex system. But the sort of result of that is he starts coughing up blood, and he's probably not got much left for the world. In the following chapter, the science town in Akadem Gorodok, but it's basically kind of dismantled, or I mean it's being the pressure is being put on. The social clubs are being closed. Zoya is being put on a kind of a show trial for some kind of a transgression, and they're kind of like it's kind of becoming clear that an era is coming to an end, and this kind of dream isn't going to play out.
Well, she's become a dissident, right?
Right. Yeah, there was something about co-signing a letter that ended up being published in the Western media. But yeah, this is like starting to really fall apart here.
Yeah, it is like because in the Unified System chapter, we see the Soviet decision makers decide not to continue investing in computer development in the Soviet Union, and instead just reverse engineer IBM's, right? And that was a complete disaster for Soviet computing. And that's why Lebedev is so determined to go talk to Kosygin, because he's like, this is going to be terrible. Like, we'll never recover from this. Like, you're destroying Soviet computing.
Right, because it condemns them to spending a decade reverse engineering a shitty chip that's like going to be obsolete pretty soon, and like they'll always be playing catch up to where the capitalists were 10 years ago.
Right. And then the next thing is that, all these sort of affordances and exceptions made for the researchers at Akadem Gorodok are being rolled back, and they're being brought back under political control. And so it's just this overall abandonment of Khrushchev's thaw, right? And his technological ambitions for the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it's very, very disappointing. Because there's a strong sense of an era coming to an end here, and what could have been a very promising track of development being cut short. And that brings us up to the final chapter, in which we catch up with Khrushchev in his country home, in his retirement. He seems kind of lost without his work. He's sort of like, still even in his retirement, has this very future-oriented way of thinking, where he kind of thinks about like all the kind of blood and the sacrifice that went into this kind of program and into the building of this society, and that it would have been worth it if it had all been prologue. Like if all of that had simply been the last spasms of the death of an old cruel world and the birth of a brand new kinder world, it would have been worth it. But then it turns out it didn't work out. So he's left with these kind of regrets and I think this is stuff that like Khrushchev was quoted on. In fact, that like when asked about regrets, he was like, just the blood, all of the blood.
Right.
It's quite a sad ending to the book.
Yeah, and as somebody who actually sort of believed in this system, and was a good Bolshevik, he's just very crushed. And there's that famous quote from him that they quote here: "Paradise is a place where people want to end up, not a place they run from. What kind of socialism is that? What kind of shit is that when you have to keep people in chains? What kind of social order? What kind of paradise?" So yeah, he's just kind of left with his regrets, and yeah, I mean, that sort of defense of the Soviet Union as like, well, it'll work out and it's all going to be worth it, which was sort of like famously formalized by like Merleau-Ponty in his defense of the Soviet Union. or I mean, many Bolsheviks said the same thing, right? That they're just so committed to this cause, this future that they wanted to see realized. And then in the end, like, what do we get? Right, we get Yeltsin, right? Just this like Trump tier, disgusting, pathetic worm of a man, right? Who's just like this puppet of the United States, is constantly drunk, everything's falling apart around him. There's nothing but graft. The mafia take over everything. It's just, complete shambles. This society in complete collapse. So, when it comes to the question of like, was it all worth it? Probably not.
No.
Right?
Jesus, of course not. Yeah.
You can say that Russia has kind of recovered a little bit under Putin, but it's very much just like this sort of desperate clinging to the remnants of Stalinism, and the old institutions of the Soviet state in a way that is about stability and nothing else, and still entirely dependent on the oil and natural gas revenues that the country can produce, right?
Yeah, it's got this like, I suppose Russia's doing fine by some metric, but I mean it's an economy
compared to the 90s. Yeah. Russia is doing fine.
It's ultimately an economy today whose main export is dash cam footage. Right. So I don't know. But the book kind of closes out with the wind in the leaves of the trees beside Khrushchev's house, saying, whispering, can it be otherwise? And the same wind blows past the window at which Vitalovich is working currently on optimizing the manufacture of steel tubes. And it closes out with a wonderful sort of passage that I'm going to read out. The hard light of creation burns within the fallible flesh. Outshines the disappointing world, the world of accident and tyranny and unreason. Brighter and brighter, glaring stronger and stronger, till the short man with square spectacles can no longer be seen, only the blue-white radiance that fills the room. And when the light fades, the flesh is gone, the room is empty. Years pass, the Soviet Union falls. The dance of commodities resumes. And the wind in the trees of Akademigorok says, can it be otherwise? Can it be? Can it be? Can it ever be otherwise? So, I mean, it's a really depressing fucking book, but like it does sort of, close out on a note of wondering, like, could it have gone otherwise? Or indeed in the future, can it go otherwise?
Yeah, and I remember this book actually provoked a lot of discussion on crooked timber, which is kind of like a shop blog, or was a shop blog for economists. So it did actually provoke... Ironically, this book actually provoked quite a bit of interest in socialist planning because it came out 2 years after the crisis really hit in 2008, right? So people were like interested, like, oh, well, obviously the capitalist system is in serious crisis. What are the alternatives? And people really did get quite interested in this book, and sort of a much more positive light than you might expect having read it. Mm-hmm. That's like, oh, well,
so
this is like an extremely sad and depressing book, but, people do take some positivity out of it.
Certainly, yeah. Like, and I think it's worth breaking down that, like, I think the sort of damning thing really is that initial conditions do seem to reign for the entire duration of some project. That, like, the founding of the Soviet Union was categorically flawed in its kind of just the conditions under which it started, right? Like, that needing to do that socialist version of a primitive accumulation put them in a position where they needed to construct that kind of bureaucracy, and that inevitably led to these kind of inevitable is a strong word, but I think it it's not really an accident that it played out this way either.
Yeah, the counter example is China, right, where they did the same thing, but then they were like, well, let's just move towards this like kind of pseudo capitalism, right? Like let's just rationalize this system by introducing markets and just maintain state ownership to a large degree, but otherwise pretty much just have capitalism with one party state.
Yeah. But I think there is sort of hope though in that, like, the way we're sort of placed today throughout the sort of the West and throughout actually a lot of the world in general, is that like we kind of are in a position to carry through like Marx's original sort of idea of a revolution, of like developing capitalism to a point where it could then be taken over by a social revolution. So like, as much as I think we can learn a lot from the way the Soviet Union played out, and specifically how the attempt to apply these technocratic sort of ideas to the planning of the economy, we also need to acknowledge that what's described in that history isn't the place that we're starting from now, that there is potential to, like, I suppose, resuscitate the idea. Or we don't even need to resuscitate it in many ways, because like you look at something like Amazon, which is a like massive, highly optimized distribution system that's computer controlled, you know?
Yeah, I mean, the technical material basis for the socialism that these people dreamed of is more or less completely non-problematic at this point. That is not an excuse or a serious issue anymore.
No. And the project for us now is, I think, mostly most like political and theoretical. That, like, I think the left sort of needs to do a lot of its homework in terms of like deep thinking about what a transition into socialism would look like starting from here, rather than like LARPing at being 1914 again.
Right. And yeah, I mean, we don't want to be 1917. We don't want to be the kind of developmental dictatorship that the communist parties around the world tended to establish, because we can see that when you set up that one party system, moving past that regime is very, very difficult. And in the case of a system of economic planning is kind of fatal, because the conflict between the ruled and the rulers is sort of materially manifested in the planning system and isn't papered over in the way that a market system can do. So if the planning system is not actually reciprocal and democratic, and the priorities that are set are bought into, it just becomes this sad farce that was the Soviet system. So, I mean, I think this book is very much worth reading for socialists. And if we do cockshot and cottrails towards a new socialism, I would like to pair it with possibly with Ellman's book on socialist planning, because I do think there's value in looking at these really hard and depressing examples, and I think we should all think about that. I would also encourage us not to become too depressed. One thing that I sort of found when I was in grad school and reading this stuff every day, which was, obviously a pretty gloomy existence, reading about all these reasons why nothing is possible, and it's all doomed to fail, right? One thing that did sort of give me some levity, I guess, was actually when Castro died. Not that I was happy about him dying, but there was a moment of retrospection on Castro's life that followed his death, where even the capitalist press couldn't deny his greatness as a person. That I think they did eventually manage to bury his memory as someone that we can all kind of find to be an inspiring person. But there was a kind of moment of a break in the discourse where people actually evaluated him on some kind of different terms that was opened up by his death. And you know, in that moment, I did actually feel like, well, maybe there's more things that are possible than all of these gloomy stories have to tell us, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think like we should absolutely learn from the intricacies of how the Soviet Union sort of system played out. I don't think we should be dissuaded in our sort of like pursuit of a better world, though. Like we still want that, and like I think socialists are very often sort of made to carry the cross for the Soviet Union, and particularly for Stalin, in a way that capital apologists are never made to do for Victorian era fucking brutality. So like while I think it's crucial for us to understand the kind of these examples and to start really, I mean, I suppose like to kind of rejuvenate the project of really doing our homework in terms of like developing critical theories and to developing new ideas for the future. I don't think we should get too depressed about how like a group of people whose best technology available to them was the abacus couldn't make it work, you know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think we need to seriously evaluate the failings of past efforts, but also not to diminish the possibilities that do exist for us, because you know, neoliberalism and the stage of capitalism that we're living in thrive on our despair. And I think that looking at these very depressing examples can easily feed into that and just lead us to become as cynical as these apparatchiks at the sad end of the USSR. But we do need to find the possibilities that exist and not minimize them, because we're coming at it from a point of despair. And I mean, I find this happens to me a lot, that, you know, I'm always led by my reading to a point of pessimism, and when something opens up and something unexpected happens, like I remember when the Occupy movement kicked off. At first, I was completely cynical about it. In the end, I was cynical about it. But there was a moment where it was like, maybe something could happen here, right? That when the I mean, for the lack of a better word, when the zeitgeist changes, what is possible and impossible in our minds changes as well. There's an emotional dimension to this. There's that levity that they were talking about in the Midsummer Night chapter that, you know, is a thing that when reading that, I could feel like, yeah, that is a thing that I've experienced once or twice in my life, that I felt like things were possible and that things could actually change. And I think, yeah, we shouldn't diminish those things just because we're often disappointed by them.
Yeah, certainly. I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Thanks, listeners, for coming along with us on this. You can find us on Twitter at GI Unit Pod. We're on Facebook. We're on whatever podcasting app you're listening to this on. I've been putting our stuff on archive.org as well, so that it will, live through the apocalypse once I stop paying the hosting on this thing. I think our next set of episodes is going to be a bit of a bigger project. We're going to tackle All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, the series of documentaries by Adam Curtis. That's going to be pretty interesting. So that'll be a 3-episode bonanza over the next while.
Yeah, and it was a partial inspiration for this book, so
yeah,
it's a good segue.
It's I think it's a really great set of films for me, because I think I was absolutely fascinated with them when they aired, and they set off a lot of interest in that kind of like the intersection of like the applications of technology and kind of how it actually applies to society and politics and human lives. We probably wouldn't be doing the show if I hadn't happened to catch that broadcast when I was going out all those years back.
Yeah, it certainly had an influence on me as well. Maybe I was kind of already in this stuff, but it was pretty impactful.
Yeah. So join us again in 2 weeks. We'll be tackling All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye.